Hello and welcome once again to another episode of Ghettofabulous, Kings of War. Today, I'm not going to do a battle report. We're going to do kind of a, what do you call it, tactical analysis. It's kind of what I was hoping to do with this whole channel anyway. Not just recount tales of battles, but talk about the thought process, lessons learned, and why things happen the way they do or decisions are made. And this time, we're going to talk about the important battle considerations, as it says on the screen, prior to turn 1. So what do you do before the first turn of movement and everything else? This kind of came about because the last battle report I did against the Abyssals, it's our regular afternoon gaming time. 2 tables are already going. I show up on the 5th person, so I start setting up a 3rd table. And about halfway through, my Abyssal opponent, Henry, shows up. He starts helping me set the table up, and he's like, all right, I'm going to start rolling for scenario and objective number. It's like, whoa. First of all, I didn't have a problem playing. It wasn't like a scheduled thing, but it's like, okay, we're going to play. It's fine. I didn't know he brought his Abyssals. I mean, I know he has Abyssals, but I didn't see his army. He could have had anything. I didn't see his army list. In the back of my mind, I'm like, I don't say panicking, but it's like, how am I supposed to pick size when I don't know what you have? How am I supposed to set out objective markers when I don't know what your army has and what my, compared to mine? But he was going in blind as well. And we'll talk about a little bit later why I thought going in blind would be an advantage for my army. But it made me think, I don't know what Henry was thinking, but there are other players out there who maybe they know they're supposed to look at the table and look at the terrain. They know they might get the opportunity to pick a side, but why would you pick one side over the other? Or okay, we're going to place objectives taking turns. I'm placing 3 objectives. My opponent's placing 2. That's probably an advantage for me, but what am I thinking? Where would I place them? Why? So that's what we're going to look into. So the first part of what to do prior to turn 1, first and foremost, look at the enemy's army list. You got to know what they have and how their army is going to function before you can make determinations on how to counter that or take advantage of what they have or don't have. And this is more important, as it says here, for if your army is slower, smaller, or has less shooting, especially than your opponent's army, then it's more important for you to see what your opponent has. If you're slower, every unit you place has a limited range of areas it's going to be able to affect the table. It just literally can't get around the table everywhere. So where you place it has a huge impact on how it's going to function for the rest of the game. If your army is smaller than your opponent's, you're going to get out-dropped. Your opponent will deploy several units after you're completely done, so they can kind of counter where you put things. So you got to be more careful, and you have to be aware that your army is going to be out-dropped. And if you're less shooty, kind of like with the slower units, if a unit can shoot, it can impact the game. Regardless of where you place it, it can have an impact on a large part of the table, as opposed to a melee-only unit that has to move to get to where it's going to have more of an impact combat-wise. So let's take a look. Here's the my goblin list and his abyssal list, 2,000 points. I won't go through and read it again, like in the battle report. But here they are. Okay, so I'm looking. I can see everything, but really, what am I looking for? So what, I guess, is the question. Well, the so what, and there's a lot of things you can look at, but some of the basic things you should be trying to consider between your army and your opponent's army is the stuff here at the bottom that I've summarized. So the Goblin army has 15 units, 15 drops, and it has the Scrying Gem, whereas the Abyssals have 11 drops. So right away, the Abyssal player should know they're going to get heavily outdropped. Goblins have 26 unit strength, where the Abyssals have about 22. Yeah, technically the Goblins have a slight advantage, but it's slight. It's not a lot. So this should be telling you I'm going to get outdropped, I'm going to be outdeployed, so I probably don't want to spread out a whole bunch. If your army is very spread out, that gives the the army with more drops, the opportunity to overwhelm one side or the other. So you probably want to stick together a little bit more. It also means when you look at it will let your opponent counter you, potentially. So let's say the Abyssal Horsemen, maybe normally you put them on a flank to use their speed, use their charging ability, kill something on a flank, and then work their way around the flank of the enemy's army. Well, if you're going to get outdropped and you place him, and your opponent has something like a horde of spearmen that are going to be a good counter for that, he can just sit back and wait. And if he's worried about these horsemen, he has a good counter for them. He's just going to wait. He's going to see where you place the horseman, and he's going to put the natural counter in a nice place against them to interact against them. So that's an advantage of the drop advantage. Next, you're going to look at speed. Overall, in my army, I've got 7 units with either 9 or 10 speed, and they all have nimble. So my army is very fast. His army has 2 flying units, the gargoyles or chaff, and then a powerful unit, the manifestation of Baal here. This means 2 things to me. One, because this army is, from the Abyssal player perspective, this army has more units and faster units, so they're probably going to be able to very quickly work around my flanks. Second, they're going to get to initiate combat first because they've got so much charge range. They will probably be the ones who are charging first. So my army needs to be prepared to counterattack and be prepared for units trying to very quickly work their way around the flanks. Whether that means I have to use terrain to try to screen my flanks, sacrifice units to slow them down. Flanks are going to be a concern for this game, for the Abyssal player. And we can look at the table here. You can see the goblins here at the bottom, a very wide frontage, lots of units, and the Abyssal player kind of in 2 force packages. And just as I was talking before about how important it is for slower armies, this is his unit of lower abyssals. Okay, so he places them there. The instant he places them on the table in that location, that limits their impact in the game. They're probably only going to be able to get to this chunk of the table to have any real impact. They can advance forward. They can kind of come through here. They can come around this way. They can hang out in their corner if they want. But that's really going to be the extent, as soon as he lets go of them, of where they're going to be able to impact the game. Whereas his flying manifestation guy over here, or this unit of speed 10 nimble sniffs, they can get anywhere on the board. So even if either I put them somewhere poorly, like a mistake, or my opponent surprised me with something, I need to redeploy, there's a lot more flexibility with these fast units. If for some reason I suddenly don't want to be on this side, and I want to get on this side of the table over here, speed 10 nimble, speed 9 nimble, speed 10 nimble, speed 10 nimble, speed 10 nimble, speed 9 nimble, we can just pivot and run over here and just abandon everything over here and be fine. Where he, with these infantry and slower units, does not have that luxury. Next thing to look at, ranged attacks. So my army doesn't have a huge amount of shooting. It's got 4 units, the 2 regiments of sniffs, and the 2 kings on chariots with short bows. Really, it's 18 inches, but they're so fast, in some ways you could kind of consider them having a little bit more range because they can move quite a bit before they shoot. No piercing or anything, nothing too dangerous, but it is a decent number of shots. Whereas the Abyssals have the manifestation of Baal that has a lightning bolt, and then these 3 fireballs, the Ifrit and the 2 Abyssal Fiends. So he's outranged, And, ultimately, bottom line, what that means is the Abyssal player probably needs to close the distance and get into melee sooner, because if it stays at a distance game, he's going to get outshot. He'll lose more wounds than I probably will. And the final piece, are there any Death Stars? Anything really dangerous you need to be aware of, keep an eye out for, and have a counter in mind right away. For me, I've only got one thing I'd consider anything like a Death Star, and it's going to be this Fleabag Rider Horde. It's pretty dangerous. 20 attacks, hitting on 4s. Thunderous 1 and Vicious naturally. It's got the Boots of Striding, so it's going to get at least one unhindered charge, and I've got a lot of Bane Chant. So really, 14 hits, Thunderous 2, Vicious, and you're going to, Thunderous 2 with the Bane Chant on it. And it's got Maw Pups, so it's going to contribute another wound or 2. So, 14 wounds is not unreasonable to expect on the first turn of this thing's charge. That's not going to kill the larva, but it has a good chance of killing pretty much anything else in this. Maybe a manifestation or somebody has a better nerve. But yeah, or the lower Abyssal Horde probably has pretty good nerve too. But that's enough to kill most things in this army in one hit. So that's something he's definitely have to look out for, especially because it's speed 10 and nimble. In his army, I don't know if normally you would consider anything in here a Death Star, but for the purposes of hitting my army, the Molochs, the Abyssal Horsemen, they're powerful enough that if they get a clean charge off, they can kill most things in my army in one go. Honestly, the manifestation of Baal, he's fast. He is powerful enough on the charge that if he works his way around a flank and can flank pretty much anything in my army, he'll wreck it. So he's something I'm going to have to focus on too. I want to kill his speed and make sure I can either alpha strike these or neutralize them with chaff until I can work them, because they're dangerous to my army. So all together, I got all these little bits and pieces. So what, from the Abyssal player's perspective, if you're looking at this army list, what would you be thinking? You're going to get outdropped, so you probably don't want to spread your army out. You probably want to keep your army fairly close together. You're going to get outsped. So your opponent is going to get the charge if he wants it, so you should be prepared to do a counter charge kind of grind battle, hopefully. But your opponent's also fast and has more units, so he'll be working around your flanks. So I need either some terrain to slow down his flanking action or some units to sacrifice to slow it down. I'm outranged, so I'm going to have to advance quickly. And I've got to keep an eye out on this one unit here, because it will nuke something if it touches it. So I need to either chaff it or hopefully charge it first. That may be tough, but we'll see. That's at least the game plan kind of going in. So now we've analyzed the enemy's army. Now we can look at the terrain and see which, the way it's laid out, how will the terrain affect me, and what should I be looking for, especially looking at picking sides. And the first thing to look at there, I think, is initial movement. The first 2 turns of the game, you're trying to move forward, you're trying to get some space, so you have space to maneuver, you're not pinned into your side of the table. So how will the terrain affect that? So for our game last week, divide the board in half. And what are we looking for? Primarily, we're looking for things that are going to affect movement, because that's what we're really focused on for the most part. When I look at this table, this top half has 5 pieces of terrain, either woods or obstacles, that are going to affect my movement. The other half of the table has 1 piece of terrain that's going to affect movement, just this one forest. So that's a pretty big difference between these 2 halves. So the question is, okay, I see I see that there is a difference. What does that difference actually mean? Well, on the side with less free terrain, the bottom half, for the first 2 turns, your army will have a lot of freedom to move. They're not being hindered, not being slowed, so you can advance, retreat, turn and move, march, whatever you want. You've got a lot of options. Whereas the enemy army, unless they've got a lot of Pathfinder, is not going to be able to move out as quickly. So if you want to advance and pin them into their side, which is usually a good idea, the side with less terrain might be what you want to do. It might be better versus a shooty army to be in the open side. That sounds crazy because that means you're just going to get shot at with no cover. But if their side of the table has a lot of terrain, you look at this here, if he had shooting units anywhere back here, there's obstacles in the way. This is a hill you can kind of barely see. There's this. So really, first of all, even though his side has a lot of terrain and my side's open, a lot of this terrain will actually give me cover anyway. It doesn't help him. But second, if he's an army that outshoots me, I probably want to get into melee as quickly as possible. I want to move as quickly as possible. And just being stuck in terrain is going to slow me down. Sure, maybe it gives me cover, but I'm going to get shot for an extra turn or two. And that's probably ultimately an advantage for the shooty army. Bottom line, if you want to advance and initiate combat, especially if you think you've got the speed to be the one that initiates the charges, you probably want to be on the side with less terrain. The side with more terrain, it might, depending again on exactly how the terrain's laid out, it might be better for a shooty heavy army. Your guys are now protected from enemy shooting because they're probably going to just sit in the cover firing. But also, you're not going to have just shooting. You're going to have some melee units too. And those defensive units might also be in cover. So now as the enemy approaches, if they want to charge, you can more easily ensure that they're going to be charging into terrain and be hindered. That makes their melee less effective, and that makes it so you get more turns to shoot. Or, if you know you're going to be outsped, and you know you're going to be having to focus more on counterattacking, you might want to have the side with more terrain. If you're going to charge first anyway, maybe you stay in the cover, so at least your opponent's attacks are hindered, and then you can be trying to set up more effective counter charges. Now again, kind of like shooting, that can cut both ways. Let's go back and look here. All right, so let's say, as we were discussing, let's say you're the Abyssal player. Let's say you want to really focus heavy. Let's say you deploy just in this corner here, okay? And you're thinking counterattacking. You're on the open side, but really the opponent, you might be thinking, well, he's got a lot of cover and stuff here. He's going to have to charge through. Maybe I get to go first. I advance. My opponent can advance a little bit. Now I'm in his charge range, but he's outside of mine. And now what do? I kind of hang out, and then my opponent charges. He's going to charge to this wood. He's going to charge across this obstacle. He's going to have lots of hindered charges. And then my army in the open, maybe even up on this hill, will not only have free, unhindered counterattacks, but I may get a bonus from this hill. That sounds good, but there are a lot of shenanigans you can pull on charges. I could make sure my unit with Strider is going to be the one crossing the obstacle. My unit with Pathfinder is the one in the forest. Or even if I've got a unit maybe here with Pathfinder, it's not going to be able to get across the obstacle freely. But if I move a other unit or an individual here, then they're forced to use their pivot and nimble to get around. Then they avoid the obstacle and they get unhindered charge. So the only way to really guarantee that you're going to get hindered charges from your opponents, or even then, because they may have Strider or something, but at least raise the chances that your opponent's going to have hindered charges, is probably to take the side that has more terrain. So when you move and set your people up, they're going to be set up right behind this obstacle. There's no shenanigans. You can't put a guy on the side here to help get around it. They're going to have to charge through the obstacle. You can place them in the forest with their frontage showing the forest here, and the unit's going to have to charge into the forest. It's true that means some of your stuff may be hindered in the counter charge, but now you're the one controlling how that's set up ahead of time, and you can make sure you're the one who's putting a unit with Pathfinder over here, or moving an individual to allow a unit to avoid the obstacle to get in for its charge. That's the thought process, at least in my mind. So we talked the first 2 turns, just kind of developing your army in the first couple turns, getting some breathing room, opening moves and chess, however you want to look at it. The next thing would be what I call follow-on movement and lateral movement. The first couple turns are moving forward, but after that, you're probably going to start moving side to side across the board. And how is the board set up to allow you to do that? And some of this stuff, not so much the first 2 turns, but planning long-term on how your units are going to move, I think affects how I'm thinking about placing my units for deployment, where I want to put them. So, again, here's our table. The first thing that jumps out to me, and it's pretty common, and it's something that should jump out to anyone, hopefully, is a large piece of blocking terrain in the middle of the table. It's common, and when you see it, what that tells me is this battle is going to be, at least for the initial part of it, divided into 2 halves, back and forth on these 2 sections of the table. Now, I don't know, that's how the first several turns will start, depending on how I set it up and how my opponent sets it up. You can see he had 2 chunks on his deployment. I had 1 huge block of my army here, and then a token couple units just to slow him down. So this side of his, the Abyssal are going to advance, crush my little resistance, and then try to come across. This is a lateral movement, later turns. My army is going to try to move forward, crush his chunk of the army, and then come across or hold him. So that's the next part. We've got 2 columns. We're going to be planning on fighting happening along these 2 fronts. And then how does the lateral movement work? Well, this half of the table, impassable terrain, a relatively narrow front here. So it's going to be hard for units, not in the first turn or 2. If it's just my units on this side of the table, I'm going to be able to pivot and move pretty easily. But if it's his Abyssals up here coming down, if they want to start moving across here, now, since it's my half and I've got units over here, it's going to be my opportunity to have units come in here and block it up. And that way, because it's a choke point, I can block up a lot of his units from getting across the table laterally. This is also blocking lateral movement in some ways. You've got a piece of blocking terrain pretty far in the corner, but then these 2 forests, they hinder movement, hinder charges, and block line of sight. So even though this half, if this is dividing the table into halves, this half is the narrower one, this is the wider half. Because of this, you would think the wider table half, and you saw earlier my army was spread out all across here, you'd think it'd be easier for me to come around and envelop his smaller army, a smaller half of the army here. But because of this terrain, this blocking terrain, it was very difficult actually for me to fully envelop it, because all of this hindered my lateral movement and ability to surround him with my superior numbers. So we've looked at the army lists, we've analyzed strengths and weaknesses, so we have a rough game plan of what our army needs to do. We've evaluated terrain and how it's going to affect movement and the flow of the game. And maybe where we want to place our units, because how the flow and how the terrain interacts will help emphasize what we want our army to do or weaken the enemy's strengths. The last part is placing objectives. And again, you're trying to place the objectives to play to your strengths. In this particular case, my opponent, he had, I don't think we actually picked table halves at this point. I think that comes after placing objectives. But he gets to place 3 objectives with his abyssals. I'm placing 2. So where does he place his first token? He places it right in the middle, or pretty close. I think this, based on the folds, this may have been the middle, but that's pretty close. And for his army, melee focused, smaller, he wants to have the objectives close together. I want the objectives spread far apart. I've got more scoring units, I've got a lot more speed. So if the more spread out they are, the more I can put a 75-point regiment of rabble out in the middle of nowhere to hold an objective while the rest of my army fights to kill the enemy, and I can easily seize these distant objectives. If he puts it in the middle, no matter where I put the objective, I mean, unless I put it way in the corner, it's going to be at least relatively kind of near where he's put it. So the middle is not a bad place for his army to go first. I think there are better places, but it's not a bad option. I place my objective way off to the side here because, like I said, it's in my best interest to keep them spread out. Now, I could place it in, even further if I put it in one of these corners, but I don't necessarily want to do that, and we'll get into that why in a little bit. But this is spread out, so that's a good start for me. He placed his second objective here. Again, I think that's an okay play. It's near this one, so if he wants to keep objectives close together, it's close to that one. It's farther from this one, though, so it's not necessarily... if he had put it like this one or over here or something, he could have had it close to both of them. And ultimately, I think having them close, clumped together is in his best interest. It does present a little conundrum for me. If I want to keep them along the center line, I can put it over here somewhere. That's going to be kind of close to this one, or I can put it in the middle here, which is close to both of these. So that means I have to place it in a deployment zone. And he's got the next drop, so that means if I put it in a deployment zone, he could put his next one, say, maybe around here or something. And then when we roll off to pick sides, if he wants to gamble, if he puts 2 deep in one deployment zone, he could maybe get this half and just start with an automatic advantage of 2 tokens right away. Or he could mirror it and put it on the other side over here, and then this half, really it's almost this third of the table, has 3 objectives, the majority. But I think ultimately this is probably the best place to put it. It's far away from this one, and I'm just spreading things out as much as possible. And as you can see on the graphic already, he puts the final one right there. This is not a bad option either. Based on where everything was, this objective is close to this one. So he's got, these 3 in the middle are pretty close. This one over here isn't too far from this one. This is the only real outlier, I think. But kind of looking at how things progressed, I wonder if it wouldn't have been better for him to place this last one, instead of placing it here, placing it over here, for example. And if you think about it in that case, you've got one off by itself. These 4 are now in pretty good proximity, and in fact, these 3 are in really close proximity. And again, they're on this one roughly third of the board. And if his army is smaller, doesn't want to get flanked, this is a good table chunk, I think, to try to run that. I don't normally run small elite armies, but I think this might be a good place to try that. For example, let's say we went with this. He put his last token over here. There's 3 objectives and these 2. He wins the roll-off for side, or whatever, maybe you lose, whatever. He's in this. He ends up getting this half of the table. His army's pretty small. Let's say he just deploys everything in here, or almost everything in here. He knows he can get charged anyway, so it's probably fine to be deeply deployed in like 2 layers, because you're going to have a couple units in the front and then a bunch of stuff in the back to countercharge with. Okay, now what's going to happen? You're back here. You've got this hill. It can either screen some of your units from these far charges, or if you press forward, some of your counter-attacking units might counterattack off of it. You've got 3 units with large fireball attacks. Maybe they're centered on this hill with fighting taking place in front of it, and they more easily get clear shots with their fireballs from the hilltop, so they can more effectively nuke units that way. And you've got this choke point over here. You're obviously going to be concerned about my stuff coming around the flank. You stick your abyssal larva, or even just the gargoyles can hold up anything. My whole army is over here. Only 1 unit at a time can fit through here. So you put abyssal gargoyles here. Abyssal gargoyles? Gargoyles. You put your gargoyles here. My guy charges in, kills the gargoyles, but everything else is sit back here. Or again, the larva can just sit here and take turn after turn and hold up everything I have over here. So I don't think this is a bad, rough game plan. Or he starts on this side. Same general idea. He deploys heavy on this side. It's a little more open over here, but you've got a hill. Again, you can barely see it. So that's going to block line of sight. So either he's going to have to move on top of the hill, in which case I might get to charge first as the abyssal player, or he's to come all the way around. And then again, it's a narrow front relatively between the larva and the gargoyles. You could hold up a lot of stuff over here. And you advance forward. You've got some hindering terrain that the faster army will have to charge across. And these 2 armies are pounding on each other on a narrow front, grinding away, which may be advantageous for the abyssals compared to the faster, more glass cannon-y goblin army. Or, to go completely different, let's say he places first token here in the middle. I placed my second token way over here. He places his third token here. I would have placed my 4th token far away again over here. And then he places his 5th token here. Now he's got 4 tokens, 4 objectives in relatively close proximity. It's on the wider half of the table, but with this chunk of 3, 2 forests and impassable, this gap and this kind of gap, lateral movement is hard. Even though this is a wider half of the table, it's not really a wide half of the table for my army enveloping him. So if he'd put everything on this half of the table and advanced, it would have been a much harder fight for me, because I couldn't bring all my stuff to bear, and his units are smaller and punchier, so he could do combo charges and counterattack pretty effectively. And still, I could try to come around this left flank and hook around, but he can try to slow me down here with the long charge to the rear of his army. And with these objectives all closely clumped together, he's got a better chance of catching multiple objectives. Just a thought. And you can see, as the game progressed, really played it, my stuff is all over the place, clumping and getting in the way of each other. In fact, let's see if I can go back. Yeah, when you go back and look at the initial deployment, I've got units, because it's such a wide frontage. There's a regiment of sniffs behind this rabble, a regiment of fleabag riders behind the chariot and the mincer. And this part is much wider than as you advance. This tree, this impassable terrain, narrows it. So it even gets harder for me to squeeze my army into this narrow frontage, which gives him an advantage. So what's that bring us to for deployment? Well, ultimately that brings us to the summary of this, what I've already talked about, between the number of drops and the speed, I think, and seeing the deployment, how it played out in reality, what it really boils down to is, again, this central piece of terrain makes two halves of the board. And I think he deployed poorly because he pretty much deployed two equal halves of his army, one on each side. And I deployed, really, this is 85% of my army. At 2,000 points, I've got 2 mincers and a regiment of rabble on the left here, just to try to slow these guys down for a turn or two. So this overwhelming force can hopefully overwhelm half of his army, kill it very quickly with minimal casualties, and then I'm way ahead. I still have a large chunk of my army to fight half of his army, which is ultimately how the game progressed. All right, so replacing objectives. I'm not sure what my thought process there was, but there's another picture of this slide at the battle again, so great. Oh, so I was just talking about this wide frontage and these units stacked on top of each other. I don't know where to go, but I want them on the side, so just back up, kind of in the way, waiting for openings so they can contribute. I still struggle with this. This is one of the things that I had a real hard time with when I first started playing Kings of War. Why would I pick a monster or a character, especially an individual, but we're going to look at a king on a chariot. Why would I pick those over a full-sized actual unit? Let's take the troll horde. A horde of trolls is 190. You have to have some kind of buff, either Dwarven Ale or Fury, to counteract their poor nerve. So we're going to build that in. Or you've got the king with the headstrong talisman or whatever. Whatever it is, you're going to have to put a few points in to count to mitigating this awful wavered value. All right. Why would I pick a giant over the troll horde, especially the second edition one on the 50 millimeter base? There's a reason you would. All right, so they're both defense 5. This one's got 14-17 nerve versus 18-20, but this one has regeneration. So as long as he regenerates once and heals a few wounds, he's ultimately going to be about as hard to kill as the giant. 18 attacks, blah blah blah, versus his d6 plus 8 attacks. What it boils down to is, against 5 defense, which I kind of almost view as the average now. You'd think it'd be 4, but it seems like 5 is pretty common. The horde of trolls should get around 6 wounds versus defense 5, whereas the giant will get almost 5. He does have brutal, but actual raw damage output is 6 to 5. And because this guy has more attacks, he synergizes better with Bane Chant. This guy does 4 wounds or 5 wounds against anything, whereas this guy does 6 against 5 defense. He'll do a few less against 6 defense, which is rare, and he'll do a few more against weaker units, which is more common. Most important, this guy has unit strength 3. In this game, unit strength is very important. Speed 6 is good. This guy only has unit strength 1. Speed 7, which is better, is pretty good, and he has Strider. But he is ultimately the Strider and the Brutal you basically get for 20 points versus the Troll Horde. And we're going to say their nerve are about the same once you get his Fury and his Fury or Headstrong. So why would you pay the 20 points to get this a couple special abilities, but a weaker unit strength thing? Why would you take King on Chariot at 130 points? Yeah, he's got a point more of nerve, but the Fleabag Riders have 14 attacks with Vicious Thunderous Charge 1 versus his 7 attacks, Crushing 1, Thunderous 1. This guy's doing almost 5 wounds on the charge against defense 5, and much more against weaker opponents. Whereas this guy's doing 2.5 wounds. This guy's unit strength 3, Speed 10 nimble. This guy's only unit strength 1, speed 9 nimble. Yeah, he's got a few weak range attacks, and yes, he's inspiring. You have to have some inspiring, but why would I invest points in the king when I could just get say a flag get on a Fleabag rider and then put the other points invested towards more regiments of the actual riders? Well, the reason is this. when you have lots and lots of these full-sized units, you run out of space for them. They get in each other's way. You can't get a lot of these big, especially if you're trying to charge. Like, let's say I wanted to charge this regiment of cavalry over here. I can only get a couple of units in there. As the game progresses, you get this cluster traffic jam of everything in the way. Whereas the giants now in 75 millimeter bases are not as good at it anymore. So they have a relatively big frontage, but they're still a lot smaller than the cavalry regiment, which is 125. So that's a significant reduction. So they can move and get in, and you can add them into a multiple charge. Normally, like this Abyssal Horseman unit here, this is a horde, my horde of Fleabag riders going in, but it could just easily be 2 regiments charging in, right? I couldn't put a 3rd regiment of cavalry in here because it'd be one centered, and then the other 2 would be corner to corner, and that wouldn't work. So this normally would be the best you could do. But this mincer with just a little 50 millimeter frontage, or a giant with 75 millimeter frontage, he could charge in as well. And if he was in the center, you have to set this kind of stuff up right. But if he was in the center, he could also be added to this charge, and suddenly you can get a 3rd unit. And maybe that 3rd unit, the giant or the king on a chariot, maybe he doesn't attack quite as hard as these regiments do, but if you can also add him to the 2 regiments attacking, suddenly you're putting in a few more extra wounds, and just a few wounds in melee can be the difference between destroying the unit and doing nothing to it. Every point counts in melee. I'm really kind of learning that, just how valuable that is. And that's why these Fleabag units are so devastating as well. Vicious adds just a couple wounds to their roll. The Bane Chant adds a couple wounds to their roll. The Maw Pups add just a couple wounds to their combat resolution. I mean, you stack all that up, you wipe out units in one turn. So there's a conclusion. A lot of stuff to think about, but at least in my mind, that's kind of the progression as I'm going before the game, looking at the enemy army. In fact, I didn't even talk about it, but I don't do it quite so much anymore. Where is that? But I used to have a mental cheat sheet. Like I would add up an army's combat value. It would be like, well, this gargoyle troop is just chaff, so it's worth 1 point. This Moloch horde is almost kind of like unit strength, but it's kind of based off of melee power. This Moloch horde is very dangerous. That's worth 3 points. This manifestation guy, he's worth 2. These fiends are probably worth 2. I would just kind of add up. And then I'd add up my army. The rabble horde's worth 2. The regiment's worth 1. The sniff regiments, now they might be worth 2 points now, because they do have vicious. But in melee, I'd probably still give them a 1. They're not that tough, and they don't hit that hard, and they're easy to kill, whatever. I'd kind of add it up, and I'd see kind of what the final result was, just so I get an idea of, can I just charge forward and overpower that guy? Or is his army more deadly in melee, more beefy? And if we just frontal attack, both of us line up and crash together, will he win? And if that's the case, then I'm going to have to really focus more on overwhelming one flank and outmaneuvering my opponent, alpha striking him, as opposed to just a straight up fight. So again, that's just kind of the thought process I go through before the first turn, all the considerations. I'm sure I've missed some things. I didn't even talk about like hills. Now they add thunderous charge. They're much more important now for your deployment purposes, especially if you have cavalry. So going to be looking out for that kind of stuff. But it's a good starter for, and who knows, maybe people have been playing for a long time, hadn't considered certain things. I think a lot of people subconsciously kind of get the idea of the lateral movement, but because it's so far, you only worry about it later in the game. They may not be thinking about it when it comes to initial deployment, and it's just a happy circumstance if it works out for them or not. But really, you should be looking for that kind of stuff. So when you're deploying, you're picking ahead of time. Do I envision myself going into the enemy's half the table and then trying to flank around? And if that's the case, if they have a lot of blocking terrain for lateral movement, I probably want to pick the side with blocking terrain for lateral movement if I'm trying to go across into his half of the table and flank around. So, I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments. This is the kind of stuff I like to talk about. I don't see a lot of other people discuss. And I think it would help people's gaming if some of the really good players, too, just maybe it's secrets they don't want to. They want to be the master and not give it all away. I'm no master, so I'll give away my secrets all day. But I think that helps everyone's game improve when you hear the thought process of not just why I built this army or why this army won, but how I implement the army or how to implement any army, how I look at the table, the tactics, and make things work. So thanks for listening.